Hello fantastic people, I hope you are doing great. Othinsson, one of our most active community members and the creator of little fun game Aiding and Abetting, has asked this very important question. How do you structure files in a larger project? By no means I am an expert in this subject because, to be fair, I never worked on really massive Unity projects. Though I have seen some really big ones outside of Unity, so I think I may have an idea or two. What's important, if you do not agree with anything I'm saying or you have some tips you would like to share, of course, please feel free to comment under this video. I would love to see how you are going about structuring your files, and I'm sure I will definitely learn a thing or two from you. So Unity provides us an amazing entry point to this discussion. The page Best Practices for Organizing Your Unity Project gives us some tips how to go about that. And there's also a free ebook about organizing your project and working with version control. So this is pretty neat. This book is 51 pages long, and in general I think when Unity releases those ebooks they are really amazing quality, so this is definitely something to go through. But for now let's just have a look at the tips they are giving us. So the first tip is document your naming conventions and folder structure. This is a very important thing, which allows you to do the second thing, which is be consistent with your naming conventions. Basically, whenever somebody tries to join your team, or even when you go back to your project after a while, sometimes your mindset changes, sometimes you started to do things different way, and you may not be able to find your old scripts, or you may not be able to navigate through your folders and this type of stuff. So this is a pretty important thing. And I know this sounds trivial, but to be fair, I think being consistent with your naming is probably one of the most important things in general, not only in folder structure or file structure, but also within scripts. So this one is a really important point. Don't use spaces in file and folder names. This is a good tip in general for anything code related, because whenever you try, exactly, they mention it over here even, you need the command line tools. So whenever you try to work with command line, it becomes slightly more difficult. It's still doable, but it is very error prone to use names with spaces. So that's the reason in most solutions that utilize command line, you will see the names containing no spaces whatsoever. Separate testing or sandbox areas. This is also a very nice tip. So in general, what they mean by that, whenever you experiment with something, whenever you try to create a test version of the script, make sure this is not kept together with the regular scripts. Otherwise, what you're going to end up with is probably having some test scripts and some unnecessary files inside of your main project or even in the repository itself. So this is actually a very good idea. Avoid extra folders at the root level. I'm not really sure why you would create folders outside of the assets folder. So for example, over here I have my project, and I don't think I never actually added something not in the asset folder, but a level above, so in the root folder. So Unity asks or advises us to do not do that, and there are probably some internal reasons. If you know what's the issue with that, please let me know in the comment. I'm really interested in seeing what's the issue there. But I never found, to be fair, a reason to do that anyway. Keep your internal assets separate from third-party ones. And this is also very important because this makes sure you do not accidentally modify code of the third-party tool unless you really know what you're doing and you really want to do that. And this is one thing. And second thing is, we'll talk about that more in a second, but very often, if there are no assembly definitions, you can very easily create one for those third-party tools, and this will help you reduce the compilation time of the script. But let's leave that for a moment. We'll get back to that in a second. And over here, we have two different examples of folder structure. So that's the first one, and below we have second one. So both of them are examples of something called horizontal file structure. Basically, when you structure your projects or even teams, you can go in two ways about it, right? So first way, which is very common, and I would say this is probably the most common way of going about your folder structure in Unity. I've seen it everywhere in example projects, in like any YouTuber that makes videos makes it this way, and so on, so on. So I'm sure there are good reasons to follow this way, and to be fair, this is sufficient for most projects I ever worked on. Basically what is happening here, inside of our assets folder, we create folders per type of asset. Right? So basically this way we separate different types of files, and whenever we need to look, for example, for, I don't know, sprites related to character, we know it will be in art, and then, for example, in sprites, this type of stuff. The same with audio, code, and so on, so on. Now, over here we have similar approach, obviously not much difference. The only difference here is really the nesting. So for example, art contains also the sound related stuff, while here the art and audio has been separated. So this is one way of going about it. And if you have a look at this little project I'm having here open, this is literally the way I'm going about it in most of my projects, though this has one little problem. So for example, over here, I have this little elf, and this little elf has been used in many different projects. Basically, when I work on tutorials, I like to reuse the stuff I'm already having. So this little guy consists of more than just sprite, of course. I have this game object with 8 direction movement script. Then I have the sprites with their structure. Then the sprites game object has the animator with my controller, which of course handles animations. And where I'm going to, if I start a new project, it is not very easy to move this little elf to that project over there, right? So I cannot just drag and drop it there and it will suddenly work, right? Because I will not have all the dependencies, all the things like this 8 movement script or my animations are not stored there. So there is alternative way of structuring your files. Basically, instead of going about it horizontally as it's shown here, so instead of separating it by type, we separate it by the set of functionalities. So normally what we would start with, so this is the way Unity suggests over here in the article. So we have assets, then I would have, for example, art. Inside of art I would have my sprites. Then I would have animations. Inside of it, maybe I would have controllers and animations, or maybe I could have them all in one folder. So let's do not complicate that, let's keep it there. Then of course I would have my scripts folder. And this is really all I would need to have for this little guy, right? So there are, let's say they are all in one file, so little elf png. Then over here I have the little elf animation controller. I don't remember what's the extension, but let's keep it this way. Then I would have elf idle. Then of course elf walk, and let's leave it at that. And then I would have my script, which would be the 8 direction movement. So you see, there is a little bit of drag and dropping. I would really have to go to several folders to find all the stuff to move it. This is so-called horizontal structure. So per type. And then we have vertical structure, which is per so-called domain or functionality. So basically what would change is I would have a folder called assets. Then inside of that folder, I would have a folder called characters, because this could be not only the player character, but stuff related to NPCs, enemies, and of course the player character as well. Inside of that folder, I would have general stuff related to all of those characters. So for example, I could have animations, and inside of those animations, instead of having the little elf animator and animations, I could have character or humanoid controller. Then we would have our humanoid idle and humanoid walk. This way we know, because it's stored in the characters folder, we know that all those scripts or all those animations can be reused by any humanoid. Of course, we could have just renamed those ones and store them still in animations. But the problem over here is that there is nothing that keeps them together with all the humanoid characters, right? So this is where I'm going. So over here, I would have another folder called scripts. Then over here, I would have 8 direction movement. So basically, if you have separated input from the movement script, so for example, I could provide input by automation script or artificial intelligence script, right? That will control how the enemy or NPC is moving, or I could just accept the keyboard input for the player. So this one could be reusable for all characters. Then I would have so let's say I can have multiple player characters, right? So I can have elf, I can have orc, and this type of stuff. So let's say player. And then I could have over here the little elf folder. In that I would have sprites. Over here I would have my little elf PNG. Then I would have, for example, little orc. The same sprites, orc, little orc PNG. Then over here, of course, once again here I missed one thing. For the little elf, I also have the folder prefabs. And over there I have my little elf. Over here, in the little elf folder, I would have also prefabs related to that little elf, and that would be little elf, right? And this way, you see everything that is related to the little elf is kept in one place. So I don't really have to search within different folders to grab all the stuff, because I know that everything there will be as close as possible, right? So it will be possible to even extract the whole character folder and reuse it in different game if I needed to, right? So this type of structure allows you to create small packages, right? So you basically keep all the stuff related to each other in one place, and it is really easy to redistribute it, right? So if you need it in other projects or anything like that, or you want to share something with somebody, it is really, really easy. This way of structuring your files has one more benefit, which is switching the mindset. So this way you have to think about creating those dedicated packages or separating everything as much as possible. This in general leads to a little bit more modular code. And when you create those folders and the structure, you have to think how they should communicate without really hardly referencing each other. So this is really, really big extra thing, though this will not always be possible. And this is probably the main downside of this way of structuring your files. So I feel that in game dev, it is not always that easy to set the boundaries between different domains or different functionalities. So even in the non-game dev related projects, you end up with namespace or project called commons or lib, where you store all the stuff that is reusable and it's kind of shared between different types or different functionalities. But this, and at the very beginning it works great, but then when it grows a little bit too much, it kind of defeats the purpose of going vertical, because you are no longer able to extract some small part and share just that. You have to include the commons, or you have to very carefully select which parts of the commons you want to ship with that. And this is literally the same thing as going with the horizontal model. So suddenly it stops having any sense. So what I tend to do, from what I'm saying, I think you can see that I'm leaning a little bit more into horizontal setup. And yes, I do. But the truth is, I try to take always the best parts of both of them. So in general, instead of having the vertical setup, I prefer to have at the base structure, so at the root folder, or rather at the assets folder, the structure that is suggested by Unity. So art, animation, scripts, and this type of stuff. But then I separate them into kind of more granular level. So I don't like to have, for example, all sprites in the sprite folder. What I prefer to do, I would rather have inside of that sprites folder another folder called characters. And inside of that folder, I would have my little elf, but also I would have, for example, the little orc. Then I would have, for example, a folder called props or level elements, right? And then inside of it would be, for example, cave elements and this type of stuff. And this is especially true for scripts. And with scripts, it has some extra benefits or consequences. So for example, in scripts, I always have the scripts dedicated to that particular game, something that I created just now for this very game I'm working on. So for example, let's say I would have the movement scripts, right? So in movement, I would have the 8 direction movement. Then I would have, for example, input, or rather game input. I never name it input for a reason I will tell you in a second. Then I have my input thingies, right? And so on, so on. Then at a certain point, I realized that I need some code that I written previously, and I have my own little library in GitHub. So when I bring it in, I have a folder called lib. And inside of that lib, I have my different type of scripts. So for example, systems. And inside of those systems, I have health system, where I have the scripts related to that particular system, and so on, so on. And those are reused by other game objects or are used inside of other scripts. Now, I said that the folder structure for scripts is especially important, and let me show you why is that. So basically, over here, I have this input actions class, which is in the folder game input. And as you see, the namespace is the same. Whenever you have the folder structure, the namespaces should also follow that structure. So for example, if I have over here, I have my tile placer class, which is inside the namespace level building. And if I get rid of that, you see my IDE starts to complain that the namespace does not correspond to the file location, should be level building. It's very easy fix. I just use the autocompletion to get it back where it's supposed to be. Now, when you have a subfolder, so for example, I have level building, and now let's say I would create another folder called tile maps, anything related to building levels based on the tile map. So over here, some random script. And you see now it's straight away in the right namespace, which is level building dot tile maps, because it follows the structure of the folders. Now, I said at a certain point that I'm using the game input namespace instead of input. And the reason for that is that sometimes namespaces clash. For example, you have some common names of namespaces that are used by different libraries, frameworks, and so on, so on. So for example, the input namespace is already used by the Unity engine. So if I try to write here input dot, you see suddenly I have this using Unity engine namespace statement, and over here I can select some stuff which is related or belongs to that particular namespace or class. If my namespace would be simply input instead of the game input, now I would have a little problem, because I cannot use, you see, if I just type input, it wonders which input I have in mind. So for example, if I do that, now I'm inside of my own namespace, right? But if I want to use the Unity Engines one, I cannot do any more input dot and done, because that's the input without anything before it. In order to use the Unity Engine ones, I have to provide the Unity Engine dot before the name. I think you can see how complex it can get quickly and how many problems it can cause. You know, you can, for example, sit there and wonder, oh hell, why I don't see something? I'm sure it was there and it turns out you are using the wrong namespace and this type of stuff. So just to give you a good example, the most common problem with that is the random class. So for example, over here, you see I'm using the random from Unity Engine random, because there's another one in the system namespace, I think. Let's remove that. And if we try to do the random, you see exactly in the system. So this one doesn't have methods, right, directly attached to them. You have to do like var r new system.random. And then you can use some methods. And those methods are completely different than the ones that we have in random from Unity namespace. So the Unity engine random. And over here we have the range and the stuff that we like and we use all the time. So this is very important to keep in mind. There is one more important thing when it comes to the folder structure for scripts, and that is the assembly definitions. When you create new scripts without an assembly definition, Unity has some assembly definitions ready, like the base level ones, and all of your scripts go to one of those assemblies. And the problem is that whenever one of your scripts, like any script, within one assembly is changed, all of them have to be recompiled. And when the number of your scripts grows, the time of the compilation of scripts grows as well. So for example, if I just add this enter over here in this one class, if I save it and go back to Unity, you see all the scripts are getting recompiled. And this was pretty short, because at this moment I have just something like maybe 10 scripts. But if I would introduce even my own library that I store in GitHub, there is around 60 or 70 classes, and this already increases the time significantly. So basically, in order to prevent that from happening, you can create your own assembly definitions. And in order to do that, for example, let's go to the game input. You click right mouse button, go to create, and over here, somewhere you have the assembly definition. Over here, we can call it game input. And once you have it, all the classes in that folder become part of this assembly definition. The only problem is that when you add the assembly definition, you have to reference all of the other assemblies that are used inside of those scripts. So for example, because those are related to the game input, you see suddenly I have an error that the type of or namespace input actions cannot be found. And you see, are you missing or using directive or an assembly reference? And yes, I am missing the assembly reference. So over here, you see I have the assembly definition references. I can simply click plus and over here select the input. And I'm having the game input system, integration tests, test framework. So of course, I'm interested in the unity.input system. So it takes a little bit of time to set up, but it is really, really worth it. So now I click apply and you see suddenly no problem over there. Now, if I change a line over here, so if I add enter over here and go back to Unity, only those scripts were recompiled. So of course, as I said, with this small number of files, you don't really see the improvement, but it is there. But it starts to become apparent when you have more files. So when you define the assemblies, you also have to be very careful about their structure. You won't be able to introduce these cyclical references. That means that if game input references another assembly, that assembly cannot reference the game input. Also, you have to remember that you can build nested assemblies. So even though I have my assembly over here, right, there is no problem with having another assembly containing that folder. Also, you have to remember that it's not only about individual assembly definition, but about the assemblies it also references. If one uses the other, both of them will be recompiled in order to check if no dependencies have been broken. But this is quite logical. Okay, so just to sum up, I think that the best way of structuring your files inside a project is to go with the simplest solution, which is creating folders per file types. Then inside of those folders, creating another layer of those folders which indicate the meaning or the purpose of those files, and then of course nest it as much as possible so the things are easier to find. Then regardless of the file structure you are going with, I think that the most important thing is to keep it consistent, both the structure itself and the naming. Then make sure you are using the assembly definitions to speed up the compilation time. I hope you found something useful in this tutorial. If so, like this video and subscribe to my channel. Have a fantastic day, love you and bye bye.